Social learning and control theories focus on characteristics of criminals and their environment. They describe how such characteristics leads one to engage in criminality. Labeling theory argues that people become deviant as a result of others forcing that identity upon them. This process works because of stigma. In applying a deviant label, one attaches a stigmatized identity to the labeled individual. Labeling theory focuses on the reaction to delinquency or criminality, both the official reaction by the justice system and the informal reaction by parents, peers, teachers, and others. Labeling theory describes how the reaction to criminality sometimes leads offenders to engage in further criminality. What labeling theory does not do is try to explain the criminal's initial acts of criminality or delinquency, the acts that result in the labeling. Rather, the theory tries to explain why some offenders are more likely than others to continue engaging in criminal behavior and perhaps move on to more serious crimes. These initial acts may result in a label such as delinquent, junkie, criminal, loser, con, felon, drug addict. While the initial act is important, it is the labeling process that transforms the individual's identity, ultimately stigmatizing him or her. The name most associated with the labeling theory is Howard Becker. The central fact about deviance, Becker says, is that society creates both deviance and the deviant person by its response to circumscribed behavior. The person who engages in sanctioned behavior is, as part of the process, labeled a deviant. In developing the labeling theory, he attempted to explain how some rules come to carry the force of the law, whereas others have less weight. His explanation centered on the concept of moral enterprise or moral entrepreneurs. These are individuals who create moral rules that reflect the values of those in power rather than an objective, universal standard of right and wrong. A couple examples: the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. This organization's mission is, and it's quoted on their site as their mission, to move public opinion sufficiently to achieve the repeal of marijuana prohibition so that the responsible use of cannabis by adults is no longer subject to penalty. And their efforts are paying off, right? Some states are starting to legalize recreational pot smoking. Megan's Law is another example. This is the law that requires those convicted of sex offenses to register as a sex offender. They have to register where they're going to reside so the public knows, and that was in response to a group of individuals who advocated for that. As a result, it came from a case. A little girl, whose name is Megan, who was sexually assaulted and actually killed as well. That is how these things start to take effect, and they also affect the laws as well. So moral enterprise is used, according to Becker, by groups seeking to support their own interest with the weight of the law. According to Becker, social groups create deviance by making rules whose infractions constitute deviance and by applying those rules to particular people and labeling them as outsiders. From this point of view, deviance is not a quality of the act a person commits, but rather a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to an offender. The deviant is one to whom the label has successfully been applied. Deviant behavior is behavior that people so label. So what effects does labeling have? Well, for an adolescent, let's say they're perceived as a troublemaker or bad influence on siblings, schools might place him or her in a separate class from students if they have behavioral problems. Neighbors may seek to avoid or tell their children, who may be their peers, to avoid that adolescent. As a result, the adolescent may seek peers with similar labels depending on the behavior. This label could have a long-term effect that they're unable to overcome, and then they continue their delinquent or juvenile behavior and commit crimes as an adult. For those adult criminals labeled as a criminal, it's hard to find a job. It's hard to get your license sometimes, or a license to work in a certain job. You're restricted to living areas, i.e. the sex offenders. You're always going to be a target for law enforcement. If you have a criminal record, they're always looking if they know who you are. Official labeling is the result of official agencies like the police and courts, their reaction to criminal delinquent conduct or suspected criminal conduct. It is said that these agencies often view juvenile offenders as bad or dangerous and treat them in a harsh manner. And being treated harshly or rejected by these agencies has a negative effect. These agencies have a powerful effect over offenders, and their actions can have a major effect on offenders. Research shows that contact with police early on leads to long-term labeling effects that can result in social problems, unemployment, and substance use. Being arrested also may lead parents, teachers, and community to view and treat we're talking about a juvenile, as a bad person, but the same thing with an adult as well, despite what that arrest was for. Could be something minor, like a theft, a petty theft. And then you get a label of being a thief. These informal reactions are just as important and more common. For example, the juvenile may encounter the police every day, may not encounter police every day, but they have daily contact with their parents. They have daily contact with teachers. The negative views or harsh treatment from these sources also creates labels and can be treated as creating labels. Once the label is instilled in the juvenile or offender and is accepted by the offender, creating a new identity, the result is that they are expected to fail. Basically creating a self-fulfilling prophecy or self-labeling. Which brings us on to one of the best-known views of labeling theory. It's the idea of primary and secondary deviance. Primary deviance refers to initial acts of deviance by an individual that have only minor consequences for that individual's status or relationships in society. The notion behind this concept is that the majority of people violate laws or commit deviant acts in their lifetime. However, these acts are not serious enough and do not result in the individual being classified as a criminal by society or by themselves, as it is viewed as normal to engage in these types of behaviors. Secondary deviance, however, is deviance that occurs as a response to society's reaction and labeling of the individual engaging in the initial behavior as deviant. This type of deviance, unlike primary deviance, has major implications for a person's status and relationships in society and is a direct result of the internalization of the deviant label. This pathway from primary deviance to secondary deviance is let's picture some arrows. We have primary deviance with an arrow. Others label that act as deviant, and then the actor internalizes that deviant label, and that leads into secondary deviance. So let's take an example. The robbery of a convenience store by a college student desperate for tuition money. Although not a wise undertaking, may be the first serious criminal offense ever committed by the student. The student may well intend for it to be the last, but if an arrest ensues and the student is labeled or tagged with the status of a criminal, then secondary deviance may occur as a means of adjustment to the negative status. Secondary deviance becomes especially important because of the forceful role it plays in causing labeled people to internalize the negative labels that have been applied to them. Through such a process, labeled individuals assume that role as deviant. And here is the social reaction, social labeling theory graph from the book, how it makes its way around. And one more point I would like to make with regards to labeling. Another important concept of the labeling theory is differential enforcement, which is the idea that laws are enforced differently based on social status. A person is labeled or can be labeled as a result of their level of status because we have different levels of enforcement. Those people that are most subject to interactions with criminal justice service actors have their labels differently applied. For example, those in power are treated more lenient than someone with little to no power or status. The police are free to use discretion when they decide what they're going to arrest or how they're going to arrest or if they're going to make an arrest. And as a result, this sometimes results in racial profiling. It is generally known, the research shows that minorities generally make up lower status. So in turn, the criminal justice system treats them differently, treats folks who are on the lower scale of social power differently. The social process theories suggest, I'm going kind of overall. Oh, here we go. Social process theories suggest that crime prevention programs should work to enhance self-control and to build pro-social bonds. Returning to social process theory as a whole, leaving the social learning theory, our third theory in the category of social process theory. But let's talk about public policy and how it fits in with preventing criminality and delinquency. So social process theories, they suggest that crime prevention programs should work to enhance self-control and to build pro-social bonds. And taking the learning theories, and this is pretty straightforward in the book. I'm just going to hit a couple points here. The learning theories have produced two successful programs. They're residential treatment programs. There are others like it that have been modeled, but these were the first. The Highfields Project in New Jersey, the Silver Lake program in LA, small group resident centers for adolescent boys, kind of helps with the social pressures and to help break down these defenses that they might have. Also helps with educational opportunities and drug treatment programs. And like I said, these are geared towards young men offenders. The control theory's focus is on the family. The family has played a key role in programs. They're designated to strengthen bond between child and parent, which is done through primarily education programming, even in the community, and they even have these programs within a correctional facility if somebody was incarcerated. There's also work furloughs that are involved. And the other component is diversion programs. Not particularly clear in the book. I'm just going to give you an overview here of how this works. This is usually within the court system. Diversion programs, restitution. When a adult or a juvenile, it's not called diversion program for juvenile, it is for adults, a diversion program. What it does, if there's an adult that is arrested, and as a result of that arrest or as part of that arrest, let's say it's involved drugs and they have a drug problem, or they have a mental health problem, there's these courts, treatment courts they call them, or diversion programs, where they divert the case into that program, and if the person's successful, then their charges go away. They get dismissed. So it kind of takes the person out of the criminal justice system and not to have that label. Restitution works a little differently. It is part of the court system, and what happens is the offender is required to pay back the victim. And we're talking about property crime, if something was damaged, or a theft kind of case. And in some cases, an individual, if there's like an assault case, if there was a medical expense, to pay back the person. And most of the time, it makes the case a little bit more lenient against the offender. It is very rare that the case goes away altogether with restitution. That may work more in a juvenile court than it does in adult court. But those are the concepts of judicial diversion and restitution. And the point is to avoid labels of being deemed a criminal if there's other way that the cases can work themselves out. So that completes the discussion on social process theories. I have a quick kind of recap about the theories. Some experts believe that criminality is a function of socialization. People in all walks of life have the potential to become criminals if they maintain destructive social relationships with families, schools, peers, and neighborhoods. Social learning theory stresses that individuals learn both how to commit crimes and the attitudes needed to support the behavior. People learn criminal behavior as much as they learn conventional behavior. Social control theory analyzes the failure of society to control antisocial tendencies. All people have the potential to become criminals, but their bonds to conventional society prevent them from violating the law. Labeling theory maintains that negative labels produce criminal careers, and labels create expectations that the labeled person will act in a certain way. Labeled people are always watched and suspected. So that is our social process theory. We will be exploring one more theory before we roll into specific crimes, but we will do that next week.